Welcome back, everyone. We are doing another opinion piece, so I hope y'all didn't put your thin skin on today. I want to talk about common mistakes I see in people's mockups that kind of make them sound not so great. So here's a list of 10 things. Number 1, using ensemble patches. Now, there's a time and place for that. If you're writing long sustains, block chords, that's fine. They often sound good. But it's not really for refined lines. Ensemble patches are usually simplified patches, so they don't contain legatos, they often don't contain all the velocities. They're lacking a lot of detail that individual patches would have. But more importantly, you lose control and you can't really shape the lines and the flow of the music. You really have to shape everything exactly the same, which in a lot of music is not really what you want. So you kind of don't have control over any counterlines, over the melody that you might want to shape individually. And of course, if it's ensemble patches that contain not just one section, but multiple sections, then you also lose control over any instrumentation, orchestration, arrangement, coloration. So it's not really the way to go unless, again, you're writing block chords or something, or you're trying to fill up something else. I do that a lot. Like, I'm a huge fan of Symphobia, for example, but I don't do it at the cost of writing individual lines into individual patches as well. Number 2, messing too much with mic positions and panning. In most modern libraries, it's already baked in. I don't know why schools still teach mockups very often, as if we're still using libraries from back in the day when, yes, they were recorded dry and you had to do a lot of work to make it sound like they're sitting in a room. Those days are gone. Most libraries are recorded in a nice room, sitting exactly where they would be sitting in the stereo field and in the depth of the hall. And the Decca tree is basically capturing all of that. I have a whole video on mic positions, so if you want to really know what each mic position is for, go watch that. But the gist here is you're doing too much. The same goes for panning. The way the libraries are recorded, the instruments are already on the left, on the right, exactly where they need to be. There is a time to add extra panning to that, which is at the end. For example, if I have a really busy cue, like there's everything going on, percussion, brass, strings, woodwinds, some synthesizers, choir, it can get a little crowded in the stereo field. So then I might decide, okay, maybe let's, pull the brass a little bit further apart or something to make more room for this and that element. Sure. But you do that at the very end and only if needed. You don't just do that by default. Number 3, not using all the controllers properly. You need to shape your lines and add expression. You need to use at the very least CC1 and CC11 or CC1 and CC7. Usually there's also something in CC2 going on. Use it. Very often I find I even have to use it a little bit over the top because sample libraries lack expression usually. They don't have infinite dynamics as a real live recording would have, right? Because you usually just have like 3 velocities or something. So they need a little bit of help. Sometimes CC1 already has a lot of volume baked into it. Sometimes it's more just of a timbral change, and sometimes the libraries are normalized, sometimes they're not. So there's a lot of products that just need a lot of CC support to sound expressive. You really need to go in and shape your phrases, taper out the notes at the end the same way that a live player would do it. Really spend some time on it, because the more you do there, the more realistic it'll seem. Number 4, disregarding mixing. This is so important. Let me play you just a comparison of a raw sample library versus when it's gone through my mixing chain. Do you hear the massive difference? A lot of sample libraries sound good out of the box, but there's a huge step up if you add mixing on top of it. At the very least, you should be adding reverb, you should be EQing your instruments, and you should be adding some saturation. I'll probably do a separate mixing video at some point. I already gave some mixing classes on Zoom, so we'll be getting into that when I feel like it. Number 5, bad arrangement, bad orchestration, bad writing, whatever that means. I mean, that's kind of a question of taste sometimes. But, you know, there are ways to clutter up an arrangement and then, you know, it's not going to sound that great. No matter how much you do in the CCs and then the mix, if the arrangement is bad, your mockup usually also doesn't sound that great. It also usually doesn't sound so great if you use the instruments in a non-idiomatic way. I know in the computer you can technically do everything. Sure, even things that a real player couldn't do. But if you constantly use instruments in a way that doesn't really make sense, and you constantly use them at the edge of their range, where players struggle usually a little bit, it's just going to sound weird. Like you're not using the instruments where they're strong. And very often also in samples in particular, if you use the extremely high range, very often you're using the same sample over and over again because the last fifth or so of the range is usually just pitch stretched. It's not recorded, it's not different samples. So it sounds even worse. Also, if you're using weird legatos, like, you know, constant portamentos that players would just not do in these spots. You know, learn a little bit about the instruments and what they play, how they're played, especially in more modern music, and maybe use them accordingly. Number 6, not layering enough. Now, I like to layer a lot. Some people disagree with me, and I don't necessarily need to die on that hill, but try it out. In my personal experience, even just layering a little bit is a massive improvement to the overall sound. Remember, we're trying to make up for libraries' weaknesses. The weakness usually being dynamic range, there's not enough velocities, not enough round robins, not enough expression, not enough detail. So the more libraries you use, to a degree, and you layer too, you basically get double the sample set, right? You get more variation, you get different players, you get different expression, different velocities. So I feel like it just improves the overall sound, especially if it's two libraries that complement each other. Maybe your go-to is a very bright library, so you layer in a warmer library to complement the first one. Or maybe you like to use a large ensemble, but you're lacking detail, so you pick a solo library or like a small chamber library to layer in for that extra detail. This is how I love to do it. It'll also help you define your own sound, really. The same goes for articulations. Ideally, if we're playing a run, sure, we could just play a patch, one patch, and have the run sound great, but that's just not how samples work. It's not how this goes. So if I'm programming a run, it means very often I have to use, you know, the patch that is made for the runs ideally, but then I also have to layer in some tremolos, sometimes some trills, you know, to kind of muddy it up and to create this kind of washy sound that you get from an actual string run, because samples often sound a bit too clean in these scenarios. But likewise, if, for example, I'm using marcatos or portatos and they're not long enough, then I need to layer in sustains and taper them out to get the exact length of the shorts, or like medium shorts, that I want. Because obviously there's only so many shorts you have in a library and they're recorded at a specific length and that's it. The same goes for something that I love to do, which is called half trem, which means you're layering tremolos into regular legatos to give it a different vibe. In a live setting, what that usually means is that, you know, everybody on one side of the stand is playing regular and then the other person plays tremolo. But so yeah, usually layering is necessary to a degree. I also like to use Cinebrass, for example, for block chords. Sounds gorgeous. But for detail and for a top line, I like to layer in Cinematic Studio Brass because it has more detail, it has more directness, it has more expression, in my opinion. Or if there's like a counterline going through the block chords, then I will do that counterline. I will layer that into Cinebrass, but I will do the counterline with Cinematic Studio Brass. That's what I mean. Number 7, not knowing your tools. I keep hammering this home because people keep buying stuff, but they don't even know the tools that they already have. You can't force a library to do something it was not meant to do. Every library has strengths and weaknesses. There are things it does well and things that it just can't do really. So figure that out. Figure out which product is good for what before you buy anything else. Chances are you already have everything you need. Unless you're a complete beginner and you're literally just starting your collection, then yes. But if you've been collecting libraries for a couple of years, you probably already have everything that you're gonna need to create a good mockup. I already made a whole ass video about it, which offended some of you, for which I'm sorry. I meant to offend all of you. Number 8, not setting up your template. There's so many people who just kind of disregard that whole aspect. They're not setting up timing, they're not setting up the negative track delays. I have template videos, just watch them. They're not setting up like at least a basic mixing chain, basic routing, you know, just basic volume balancing, gain staging. Don't underestimate that. Having a proper template in which all of your libraries are properly set up and they all function the way that you need them to function is going to improve not just your workflow, but also your production quality. Number 9, not working in the grid. And I will die on this hill, even though plenty of people will say, no, you can't work in the grid. I don't care. If you're a film composer, you will need to make a lot of MIDI edits. And if you don't work in the grid, you're gonna end up with a session that's held together by thoughts and prayers, okay? And then it'll take you 3 to 5 business days to clean that shit up. But there's also a practical explanation. Sample libraries, especially if you layer different ones from different companies, are made by human beings. They're not 100% edited properly. So there's already natural variation in the sample. Sometimes a little too much. Like sometimes we can edit a bit more cleanly, okay? Just saying. Not looking at specific developers. Like if you don't work in the grid, it very often sounds like a high school band that just can't keep tempo. And a lot of people are like, oh, but isn't it gonna sound stale? I mean, work in the grid first. Usually it's gonna sound fine, especially with sustains and stuff. There are some instruments where it can get a little stale, like piano, harp, snare drums, anything that has like a very precise attack. Sure, then at the end you can go in and use the humanize feature. It'll still stay in the grid, which is fantastic, at least in Cubase. But you can add humanization where during playback it will just add a tiny little bit off-grid behavior in the MIDI. So you can still make your MIDI edits when you get a new cut or you adapt a previous cue to a new scene. You make so many MIDI edits, just please don't underestimate it. So if you don't work in the grid, it's just not gonna, you're gonna waste so much time cleaning it up every single time. And again, it doesn't sound bad. Most of the composers that I've worked for have worked in the grid. There's a couple of outliers, but they also usually have an armada of assistants cleaning stuff up for them. We do not have that. So let's maybe work properly from the start. I've also had it where some of my additional writers at the very beginning, like years ago, didn't work in the grid and they printed their stems and it was so far off the click sometimes that it really sounded wacky if you turned on the click. But the players, the live players, if you have live recording, they're gonna play to the click and they're really precise. They're not high school players, they're professional studio musicians. If you tell them to play on the click, they will play dead on the click. And then it sounds weird, first of all, with your mockup, because now your mockup sounds like it's super out of time. But then also, The players get confused if they hear the backing track and just it's kind of all over the place, and they kind of try to play with the backing track, and it's just usually what they then do is ask you to turn it off and just leave the click with them, because they're like, this is just not very precise. So my idea here would be work on the grid first. It's more practical workflow-wise, and you're not really sacrificing any quality in the mockup. I have never had anybody complain about my mockups being stale or anything, and they're all in the grid. And then at the end, if you feel certain instruments do sound stale, then go ahead and add the humanization feature. And number 10, use synthesizers to support the sound. We use synth patches all the time to thicken up the sound. The most common one is putting a sine wave under the contrabasses, or some kind of synth bass. Even John Williams has done this in his old Indiana Jones scores. He has synthesizers in there supporting the bass. So even a purist like him has done that. But more modern composers in general like to do that, just to, it kind of opens up the sound a little bit. And makes it warmer. But also very often we like to use synth pads to fill up the strings, or synth patches that sound very brassy to double the horns or fill up the brass, to thicken up a leading brass line or something. You'll also often hear if a cue has, or if a track has really cool percussion, I assure you that a lot of the percussion in there has synth percussion layered in. That's part of what makes it so distinctively cool. So try it out. Try out some synth patches. Find some go-to patches with which you can thicken up the orchestra. If you want a more produced sound, or if you feel like this and that is sounding too thin, synthesizers can be your savior there. Anyway, I hope this helps, and if you disagree and want to yell in the comments, I recommend you go touch some grass, because we're on a floating rock in space. It's not that deep. It's not that serious. Go practice.